I'm an ecologist by training. I spent all of grad school outside in rural Tennessee hanging out with frogs and salamanders and turtles. The lab I was in wasn't exactly well funded, so we had to work with the limited resources that we had. I've heard stories from folks about the weird Walmart runs or Target runs they've had, but for me it was more about my dual role as scientist and groundskeeper. One day, after weed whacking or weed eating, whatever you call it, around one of our outdoor areas where we did our experiments, I slowly noticed that I was having some trouble breathing. Not like shortness of breath or anything, but just trouble getting the air through my throat and into my lungs. I realized that my throat was closing up. When I was out weed whacking earlier, I had failed to notice that there was poison ivy mixed in with everything else. And so when the machine hit the ivy, it would cut it, but then throw all these little particles into the air that I ended up breathing in. As my throat was closing, I made a call to my doctor, who wrote me an emergency prescription for a steroid and suggested that I immediately chow down on some Benadryl. I ended up being okay, and after a few days, frankly, I was back to normal. Now I have a house and land in the yard, and I love doing yard work. But I'm always especially on high alert for poison ivy. Everyone has a story, even, or maybe especially, scientists. Science affects each and every one of us. Let's talk about it. From the American Geophysical Union, I'm Shane Hanlon, and this is Sci and Tell. Welcome to episode 2 of Sci and Tell. If you missed our kickoff with Karen St. Germain, it's one up in your feed or at sciandtell.org. For this episode, we chatted with Sharmila Bhattacharya, Chief Scientist for Astrobionics at NASA Ames Research Center. Basically, she studies how space affects humans. And while she doesn't have a story about poison ivy, per se, she's definitely had some interesting experiences out in the field. Our interviewer was Paul Mullen.
So my name is Sharmila Bhattacharya, and I work for NASA headquarters. So I'm a scientist, and my role is I'm the program scientist for NASA's space biology program. So this is the program that's interested in looking at the fundamental biology of how systems respond to the space environment. And so my job specifically is to help NASA make strategic plans and prioritize the science that we do so that we can keep, so we understand how to sustain, habitation as well as exploration. When astronauts go into deep space for periods of time, we have to understand how to keep them safe, how to send, food with them and all of this good stuff, as well as do science alongside that to understand the underlying changes that happen to systems in space, so that in the big picture, then at the end of the day, we can keep humans safe in space. As you know, now NASA works, and works alongside many of these, the SpaceXs and the Northrop Grummans and the Blue Origins today, so that we can work as partners to getting things into space. And my interest is, of course, in ensuring that we get the science reliably and frequently into space so that we can do our investigations. So I think it starts with the fact that I really enjoyed science, but, I also loved English. So I loved writing, I loved reading, I still do. So literature, was something that was very near to my heart as well. I loved math, I liked physics, I liked biology, I loved chemistry, I loved history, right? So in some ways it was a tough choice. So when it came to choosing the one path, it was a little bit of like a toss up, because, and then it struck me that, okay, which part of science, so let's say if I want to do science, which part of science do I love? And then I think, biology for me was what came to mind. And then I thought, okay, and I love writing. But then, in biology, and frankly, this is something that maybe a lot of young folk who are interested in science careers may not think about, but writing and communications and reading and literature, all of this actually tie in, and history tie in very much together, because no matter how good your science is or how well your experiments go, if you can't communicate that, and if you can't write grants effectively, then you don't get funded. Or if you don't communicate effectively at a conference, then your colleagues don't understand what work you're doing, and then you may as well not have done it, right? So communications, writing, English, all of this actually flows very nicely together with science. And so at the end of the day, I think as I grew, in age and maturity and experience, I realized that it's not really that much of an either or. I think the biggest challenge is funding. So science, and it's something, Paul, that I think, it jumps out at us today as we're in the middle of a COVID pandemic, where what are we looking to as the holy grail that's going to get us out of this? It's science, right? It's the vaccines that are going to be developed. It's the interventions. It's those medications, it's the drugs. That is what's going to get us out of this. And so I think what sometimes we as people, as a nation, and perhaps even sometimes globally, what we forget, we take science for granted. We assume it's going to bail us out of situations, but we often don't fund it to the extent that would really be helpful when we need it. And if you think back, to the heydays of most nations, including ourselves, and we think of the Apollo era, we think of, sending humans to the moon for the very first time, right? It was all based on having a solid foundation of funding for the nation for science. And I think so when I look back, just at even from my personal standpoint as a scientist, having a career in science, I think the biggest challenge for most scientists is the funding.
If you could be doing anything else, you think, with your life, and if you didn't end up in the sciences, what do you think you would have done?
Theater. 100% theater. Yeah, I did a lot of plays and theater growing up in school, K through 12. Loved that world. Then, of course, as I got to college and things just got busy, and I was majoring in biological chemistry, not theater, so I didn't even have time to take theater courses actually in college. But then in grad school, actually, I did participate again. So high school, I'd done some even semi-professional type stuff. And then in grad school, then I worked with some other groups outside of the university, and we put some small, like community type theater that I participated in that I loved. But that's the thing, is as you get more and more, focused on your expertise, your area of expertise and in your career, you really got to pick one. And so, and I love both, but I really did love the science. And of course, it's hard to make a living off of theater. Not that it's that easy making a living out of science, but, of the two, since I love both, I figured, maybe someday I'll get back to theater. And I certainly attend the theater a lot to watch others on stage. I just love it. But maybe when I retire, maybe I'll, go back to some aspect of theater if I can.
What was your favorite role you ever played?
Oh, goodness. So it was a play about Alan Turing person. He was English, and he was the person who actually broke the code for World War II, the German code, during the war. And that was a huge turning point, for the Allies. And so there's a story about his life. And so we did that as a play. And I played a role as, a lover for Alan Turing, and really enjoyed, because actually more than anything else, there again, I enjoyed learning about his life and he faced challenges like you wouldn't believe, and just learning about his challenges and how he handled it and lived to still produce something that was so critical for the country. So yeah, I guess maybe that would have probably been my most fun role. The thing that I think in life in general that I'm most proud of is having raised a decent, kind, intelligent, and loving human being, which is my daughter. The day, if I had to think of what is the one thing that I am really proud that I spent a lot of energy and time doing, it is, raising a good human being, a good citizen for the future.
Well, and you mentioned when I asked that, your greatest personal achievement is the woman your daughter turned out to be. You don't do that without having a grasp on work-life balance and being able to know, prioritize. What advice would you give on how you're able to manage that work-life balance?
I think the main thing is I just really enjoyed parenting. I loved spending time with my daughter. And I love doing the things together that we did. So I think the main thing is to look upon it as fun. And, of course, it's not always fun. We who are parents know, there'll be days then they're sick. There are days you have an important meeting where you can't, where you've had to prepare and you just can't take a breather for days on end. And that's where I think actually having supportive friends and families and partners around you can, be a huge help. And that's how it was for me. Very fortunately, I was able to rely on help, whether it was from my partner, whether it was from my mother, who on occasion would, come and stay with us when my daughter was young. My husband and I always juggled our schedules so that we were never out of town on work travel at the same time. So it takes coordination. We had friends and neighbors who were this amazing supportive community who we could rely on. My friend and neighbor across the street, Barb, she was like a second mom to my daughter on many occasions. So it's all, as they say, it takes a village, right, to raise kids. And it's so true. Building that support network and having that group around you is really good, not just for working parents, but also, I think, for the kids.
Did your daughter end up in the sciences?
She did, actually. She majored in biological chemistry at Brown University. So yes. Now she's very interested, of course, also in, business and commercial, companies. So she's working in a healthcare consulting company after graduation. But yes, she's definitely a very analytical thinker and very interested in science for sure. And one of the reasons I think it's very important to have these conversations that you and I are having today is that it's important to communicate to people, whether it's to my mother or to my grandmother or to my, uncle, what it is that we do and why it's important and how it contributes to society is a very important dialogue for us to continue to have. And so for those kids who love science, it's important for them to voice that interest to the adults around them, because that's how folks realize the value. And that's how we as a nation, invest in the future of our country by investing in science, going up forward. One more thing I would say, yes, the first about raising their voices, being an important part of the nation's discussion, as they are doing today in politics and in many other things, and they need to continue to do that. In addition, one thing I would say to our young scientists that, a career in science is really fun. And it is something that you can be sure of will never get boring, will never be repetitive. It's collaborative, and also people sometimes have this view of that scientists are siloed in their own little world and you don't talk to anybody. No, science is a community. It's, as we were saying earlier, it's all about communication and collaboration and partnering and talking to other scientists and exchanging ideas and working as a team, across disciplines. You are really interested in biology, but somebody else and their computer science skills, and somebody else with their math skills, and somebody else with their mechanical engineering skills together, build an experiment and build the hardware to do in space. And that's how we do it. I work with folks in the, planetary science and earth science and computers and, engineering, and all of us together make it happen. And so it's really fun. You never stop learning, you're forever learning new things. And I love that.
I'm with Sharmila on this one. I love learning. Years ago, when I was that grad student and sometimes landscaper, I would have laughed folks right out of the field if someone had told me that I'd be a professional science communicator, storyteller, and podcast host, all while still being in the sciences. I'm definitely inspired after listening to this story, and I want to thank Sharmila for sharing it with us. Special thanks to NASA for making this episode possible, and to Paul Mullen for conducting the interview. If you've liked what you've heard, stay tuned for future episodes. You can subscribe to Scientel wherever you get your podcast and find us at scientel, all spelled out, .org. From this scientist in a studio to all of you out there in the world, thanks for listening to our stories.